Listeners, readers, welcome to the Foxed Page, where we dive deep into the very best books. You'll come away with a richer understanding of the text at hand, all while learning to read everything a little better. I'm Kimberly Ford, one-time adjunct professor at Berkeley, best-selling author, and PhD in literature. Today, we are diving into James Baldwin's unbelievably great masterpiece, Go Tell It on the Mountain. Many of you know that it is just about the 100th anniversary of the birthday of James Baldwin. He was born August 2nd, 1924, and we kicked off our celebration here at the Foxed Page with a discussion of Giovanni's Room, which is a novel that I really loved. If it's one that you're interested in and you didn't watch the other lecture, then just get yourself right back to the list and take a listen to the lecture on Giovanni's Room. In that lecture, we focused mostly on looking at the novel through the lens of figurative language. So I had never read any James Baldwin before that, and first and foremost, I was absolutely floored by the prose. This is one of the most incredible writers I've simply ever read, and I've read a lot of writers in my day, and in fact, a lot of writers whose prose is lauded and is seen as incredibly revolutionary and really people working at the height of their powers. And even given that context, James Baldwin is just an unbelievably talented writer with an unbelievably rich body of work. I get the sense that we've only scratched the surface, but Go Tell It on the Mountain is known in some circles as his masterpiece. I'm very happy that we did in fact look at Giovanni's Room first. That is a very slim novel, and in fact in some ways it's much smaller in scope. Go Tell It on the Mountain, on the other hand, it's not a long novel, it's like 225 pages, something like that, but it is so enormous. This is a book that I feel a little trepidation about diving into, only because I worry about doing it justice. The depth and the complexity, together with the clarity of this book, is absolutely astounding. I was also just so taken by the maturity of it, the themes that it is tackling, also the prose. This is not the prose of your average 29-year-old man. This is in fact the prose of someone who is working at the absolute height of his powers. We see a lot of figurative language here again, and it is used in the most skillful, but also the most purposeful and most effective way. We also see an incredible structure. This book is structured in a unique way that is so telling and is so important given the message that Baldwin is trying to convey. There's also incredible narrative stance, there's incredible character development. It's just a genius piece of work, and I'm really excited to dive in, although again, a bit afraid that I won't be able to do it justice. For those of you who like an agenda, here's what we're going to be up to. We're going to do a very brief bio of James Baldwin. I did a slightly longer one when we talked about Giovanni's Room, so if you want more of that, you can go and look at that, although I have to say most of it came right from Wikipedia. I'm going to reiterate something that I say occasionally, which is that I am not someone who is overly interested in the biographies of these people. James Baldwin is such an enormous figure in terms of American history and the civil rights movement, and has become a very important figure in terms of queer literature. He's just someone who's incredibly important, and his biography is such that I almost feel that I have to tell you up front that I'm not an expert on James Baldwin, but I am someone who feels like she has gotten a pretty good handle on Go Tell It on the Mountain and is very excited to share that with you. But if there are inconsistencies in the biography that I am telling you about, I am not a historian. I am not someone who claims to be a Baldwin expert by any stretch, simply because my emphasis is far more on the prose. After our very brief bio, we will dive into the book. We'll talk about the cover art, the title, and then we're going to dive into the prose itself. After that, we're going to talk about narrative stance. The book is told in a third-person narrative stance, but it's a close third, and it's really nimble and impressive, and I think a very important element of why Go Tell It on the Mountain is such an incredible piece of work. We're then going to look at structure. The structure of the book, as I mentioned, is unique. We have John's perspective, John Grimes, arguably our protagonist. We have him bookending the novel with parts at the beginning, at the end, and then we have the three pairs of the saints, Florence, Gabriel, and Elizabeth, in the middle. So we're going to take a look at the structure because that's one of the most impressive facets of the work. We're then going to talk a little bit about so what. It's one thing to sort of note these things like what narrative stance are we talking about or how is the book structured. It's another to understand why, in fact, those things are so important and why the choices that Baldwin is making are so fundamental in terms of the overall achievement of the novel. We're going to talk a bit about figurative language. And in this case, we're going to also ask that question, so what? There's lots and lots of figurative language throughout Go Tell It on the Mountain. And there's a reason why that is the case. And we're going to discuss it. And it's not just that James Baldwin isn't really, really good with figurative language. He's not just showing off. It, in fact, has an incredible purpose. And we're going to talk about that. We're going to end by walking through what I see as the culmination, which is the threshing floor, which is the last part of the novel. And we're going to walk through essentially all of the different things that are happening in that very brief section at the end of the book. So before we dive in any deeper, I want to talk briefly about the names. I'm essentially just going to list them. So any writer worth his salt is going to think long and hard about the names. And these names are so incredibly telling and so important because the bulk of them are biblical. So you have the weight of the Bible behind each one of these people. It is so significant. And even someone who has kind of cursory familiarity with the Bible, lots of these were very obvious to me. But it still doesn't feel very heavy-handed. It's not like hitting you over the head with the significance, but it is such a power move to literally put the weight of the Bible and these biblical stories behind each of these fictional characters. It's also interesting to me that James Baldwin's name, James is also a biblical name. He's one of the 12 apostles. He's also known as the supplanter or the replacer, also God's son. So the idea of James himself, that's a very significant name. And in fact, choosing John, who is another one of the apostles, is like a very kind of very cool kind of lateral move on his part, James and John being somewhat kind of parallel in the Bible. Of course, it's extremely important that John, who is our protagonist, he is John the Baptist. This is someone who is essentially going through, he is going through his own sort of baptism in the, again, I'm not someone who knows a lot about the church, but I think this kind of dark night of the soul that he is experiencing and his awakening on that seventh day, having moved through this question of who his father is, and having sort of received God, I think you can look at it as a kind of baptism. And so the name John the Baptist is really so strong. But we also have this. So Elijah means God is my salvation. Elijah is also about devotion and duty. This is an Old Testament name. And Elijah was someone who went into Persia and in fact fought for the Jewish people and was a real savior of the Jewish people. So you have this idea of Elijah as being this very, very old biblical name, which is amazing because he's a relatively young preacher, but it's going all the way back to the Old Testament in a way that is really, really skilled. Then, of course, we have Gabriel. So Gabriel is the one angel. The rest of them are people who are in the Bible, but not necessarily angels. So Gabriel is, in fact, the, hark the herald angels sing. That's when Gabriel comes and tells Mary, in fact, that Jesus is the Son of God. So you have this idea of Gabriel as being this really important messenger of God, and in fact, like someone who is doing God's bidding, which is deeply ironic because he's such a sinner, and he's such an ass, and he's, fondling his daughter, and he is physically abusive to his family, and he's just absolutely overbearing for all of them. So this idea of naming him after one of the angels is so amazing because of the irony involved. We then have Elizabeth. I didn't really recognize Elizabeth as a biblical name, but it is. It means God's promise. So that is the mother figure in the story. We also have Deborah, who is the first wife of Gabriel. And Deborah means prophetess. She's also a judge. And she also led a revolt. So Deborah is someone who, she's not in a huge position to judge, but she in fact dies without having had any children. She is someone who experienced rape by white men when she's young. So she's someone who would have every reason to judge, but maybe her dissatisfaction with the way things are going with Gabriel is a kind of prophecy in terms of how his life is going to go. Then we have Esther. So Esther means hide or star. It's from Hadassah in the Hebrew. So this is another Old Testament name. She is someone who snuck into Persia and essentially, on behalf of the Jewish people, stood up for the Jewish people and defended them. So you have this idea of her as being this hidden force, but also being this kind of sneaky force for good. So in the story, she is, of course, the person that Gabriel has the affair with. But we're very sympathetic to her. She is someone who's very powerful. She's someone who knows her mind. She is someone who's not going to easily be led astray. She arrives at the church when Gabriel is preaching, but does not, in fact, become a part. She is not sort of swayed by all of his words. So she's someone we have sympathy for and someone we respect. And it is so tragic when she does, in fact, die, and the young child royal perfect segue into the name Royal. Interestingly, so this is a French and British name. It is not, in fact, a biblical name. It's the only name that is not biblical in the book. So you have this idea of Gabriel as naming his son Royal. And not just one son, both of his sons. Two of his sons are named Royal, and both of them meet the same very bad end where they are stabbed. We don't, in fact, know if Royal II is going to die, but Royal I did in a bar fight in Chicago. But you have this idea of like this very worldly ambition. So Gabriel, he's announced in the Bible, he has announced the birth of Christ, and he is someone who's supposed to be very devout. But in fact, because he is naming his firstborn sons Royal, you have the sense that he has a lot of sort of worldly ambition and is not only driven by spiritual things. We then have Sarah and Ruth. Those are the younger sisters. Sarah is known as a royal princess or a mother figure, and Ruth is known as a compassionate friend. So I loved looking at all of these names because, in fact, there is so much nuance, and each of these characters really is expanded and gains depth, in large part because of all of the weight of the Bible that is behind them. So we're now going to dive into our brief biography. This will be brief, but it's important because, in fact, Go Tell It on the Mountain, it's a novel. There's that boilerplate stuff about how that, this is fiction and anyone resembling real life people is a coincidence, that kind of thing. So there is that disclaimer, but this is widely known as a semi-autobiographical novel. It's the first novel that James Baldwin writes. It's in 1953 when he's only 29 years old. And he himself said something to the effect that this was the book he had to write before he wrote any other book. And it's important to take a look at some biographical elements because, in fact, they map very convincingly onto the fiction. So we could look at this as a piece of fiction and it would be equally powerful, but it is interesting, I think, in its kind of human nature to be curious about the ways in which these are real lived events. Also, throughout Go Tell It on the Mountain, he's doing this very important task of discovering his father. There is a sexual awakening, there is a religious awakening, certainly, but there is also the story of someone who has grappled for a long time, if not through most of his life, with the question of who his father was. So let's get to the biography. James Arthur Jones was born on August 2nd, 1924 in Harlem. As I said, we've just celebrated the 100th anniversary. So he was born in essentially what is the middle, right in the center of the Harlem Renaissance, which people date from 1918 until about 1937. I'm not sure which works people are using to date that period of time, but this was this moment after the Great Migration, once Black people had left the South and were coming up to find a better, more just way of life in the North, insofar as they possibly could. And you have this incredible outpouring of creative work, both fiction and music and theater pieces, a real time of a lot of creative energy and a lot of creative output. So he's writing after the Harlem Renaissance, but certainly that has a huge impact on his creative work. He was born to a single mother, much like John in the book. And throughout all of the biographies that I looked at, I did not just look at Wikipedia because I was doing some sleuthing here. They say that his mother never told him about his biological father. They do not say, in fact, that James didn't know about his biological father. There's wording about how he treated his stepfather essentially as his father. He called him his father. But my sense, and this is a very important element of the lecture, is that one of the things that Baldwin is doing in Go Tell It on the Mountain is imagining both his biological father and a version of his stepfather. So in many ways, Richard, who is the biological father of John, he's a really, really important character. He's not seen in the novel a ton, and he doesn't come into the novel until, sort of 3/4 of the way through. But for my money, it's an incredibly important passage because, in fact, Richard is someone who is educated. He is someone who is somewhat nonconformist. He is someone who lives passionately. He is someone who is not going to suffer, in fact, takes his life instead of suffering in jail. So he's someone that we have a little bit of ambivalence about, but someone who Baldwin is exploring because I think that he knows, in fact, that he has a biological father who is not David Baldwin. And he's really trying to explore that potential biological father. Of course, the depiction of Gabriel Grimes in the novel is also another imagining and another way of almost sort of exercising and understanding, as far as I think about it, his stepfather as a figure. So his mother, Emma Jones, comes up from Maryland, has a son, And when James is about 2 or 3 years old, she marries David Baldwin, and young James takes David Baldwin's name. In the novel, much is made about the fact that John is nameless until Elizabeth meets Gabriel. And at that sense, the narrator is already referring to John as Johnny. So my sense is that namelessness has to do with the surname, has to do with the last name. And in fact, James would take on the name Baldwin. So he was the eldest in his family. His mother would in fact go on to have 8 more children with David Baldwin. And in fact, David Baldwin dies right around the time that she has the last of his children. So she has James and then the 8 other children. And in fact, it was up to him in many ways as the eldest male to work very hard to support the family financially. Right from the beginning, though, he was recognized as very bright. And it is noteworthy that in the novel, Richard is seen, his biological father, the one that he's conjuring in the novel, that person is seen as incredibly curious. He is not someone who's had formal schooling, but he's someone who says, in fact, that he wants to understand everything. He spends time in museums, he reads, he is someone who's an autodidact, who's really digging in to information and really wanting to understand the world around him. We also know from biographical data that David Baldwin and young James did not get along. David Baldwin was someone who, by many accounts, was born as an enslaved person and who had a really deep hatred of white people. Because his son James was friends with white people, and because he, in fact, was very bright and ended up being in public schools where he had lots of white friends, and because he was a kid who was very interested in reading and in theater and in going to the movies, his stepfather was in fact very concerned about his salvation and also just seems like a very difficult man and in fact was physically abusive. And we have description of Gabriel Grimes in the novel that depicts this right from the start, which we will look at. We also know from biographical data, again, like this is Wikipedia, that when Baldwin was a young teenager, he began to feel sexual desire for his peers, for young men. And because he was uncomfortable with that, he turned, in fact, to religion. His stepfather was a preacher in a storefront church in Harlem, much like the one that we see in the novel. And young James turns to the church as a way of pushing away this kind of sexual desire and awakening. But by the time he's 29, and before that, because he was writing this novel for a long time before it was published in 1953, in fact, there was an early draft like in 1938 that I believe he sent to Richard Wright. So this is a novel that he had been working on for most of his adult life. We see him turning to preaching in order to sort of stave off this sexual awakening, but turning to the church also really helped him to recognize his voice and the power of words and the power of the voice. So again, in many ways, a lot of this biographical data can be sort of mapped very directly onto the character of John Grimes in Go Tell It on the Mountain. We're now going to dive into the text itself. So we're only going to talk briefly about the cover art. I like this edition that came out from Vintage. I like the way that my small library of James Baldwin books have a certain continuity, but I was a little bit disappointed. I really like the fact that one of them has a photograph of James Baldwin, and he is someone we have a decent number of photographs of. So I was sort of hoping, in fact, that they would be able to secure the rights to use one of those. But also, I think that there's a little hedging going on here because, again, this is not a biography and it's not an autobiography and it's not a memoir. This is, in fact, a novel. So it makes sense to me that they would have someone who is not Baldwin, but it almost makes me wish they didn't have an image of a person at all, but in fact, did something else. If you're watching the YouTube, I'll put up some other examples of covers of Go Tell It on the Mountain. I do, though, really love the title. So it is a hymn. And this is a book that, again, very steeped in religion. And because it is so concerned with voice and so concerned with language and with the Bible and with preaching and with like the word, like God and the word, it makes a lot of sense that we have all of these different hymns all throughout. I really was waiting the whole entire time I was reading to have Baldwin include Go Tell It on the Mountain as a hymn in the novel, and that does not happen. And I really, at least as far as I can tell, I read this pretty carefully, but we do have a refrain that happens over and over again where people talk about the steep side of a mountain and the steepness of the mountains they have to climb. What I like about this is, of course, we know, a lot of us know, in fact, this hymn. It's a very popular one. Go tell it on the mountain, over the hills and everywhere. Go tell it on the mountain, Jesus Christ is born. What I like about this as the title is it is a hymn about rejoicing. So this is about, Christ being born. This is a happy hymn. It is not one that is very sad, which we see lots of those throughout the novel. And what I like about this is I imagine that this goes along with John's eventual spiritual awakening. So Gabriel was the angel who announced the birth of Christ to Mary. But I like to think that Go Tell It on the Mountain, which is not, it's not Hark the Herald Angels Sing, and it's not Gabriel announcing the birth of Christ. I get the sense that Go Tell It on the Mountain essentially belongs to John. So I love the idea that this whole entire book is essentially him talking about absorbing and accepting the idea of Jesus Christ, but it's also because we don't have it in here, or at least like very obvious use of the hymn in the novel, you get this sense that this is something to come. This is the voice that 14-year-old John in the book is going to have. He is someone who is in fact going to go tell it on the mountain. This is the beginning of him being a preacher. This is the beginning of him using his voice and finding the power of the voice. So I really love the title. I also really love that it is a hymn that is in fact so popular and that would resonate with so many people. We then get to the dedication. It says, "For my mother and father." So these are capitalized. A lot of this book has to do with seeking fathers and finding fathers and just the idea of fathers. And I mean that both in the sense of like biological fathers, but also the sense of spiritual father and the sense of like God as like the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. So this notion of finding a father in terms of God, but also of course finding these different fathers that John has in the novel. It's very important to me that James Baldwin is dedicating the book both to his mother. He had a much better relationship with his mother. In fact, he credits her for a lot of his intelligence and his ability to use words. But he's also including his father here. And my sense here, I mean, you could imagine that this has kind of a dual meaning here, that it's both to his biological father. In fact, it could have like a triplicate meaning with, his father being God, also his biological father and his stepfather. At the end of the book, we're going to see the beautiful way that James Baldwin includes the character Richard, who is the biological father of John. In the end, we hear his voice and we hear him refer to himself as daddy. So we have this sense of a daddy and then also father, and the formality and the sort of godlike nature of the word father make me think, in fact, that this is a reference not to Baldwin's unnamed biological father, who had the last name Jones. Okay, we're going to move on. The table of contents in this book is very important. So we begin with part 1, the 7th day. So on the 7th day, God rests. That is Sunday of the week. It's the Sabbath. And the Sunday is very important in this book because it begins on Saturday morning, which is in fact John's birthday, and it ends 24 hours later on the morning of the 7th day. So I love this idea here that we have this sort of announcement of the 7th day, the idea of rest and the idea of being complete. This is, this is after God has created everything, and we have this sense of completion. So we're starting with this idea of completion. We then, in part 2, we have a subtitle that is the prayers of the saints. So this was so interesting to me. I actually had to go back and do a little defining for myself. I think I loosely had an idea of saints, but I was a little confused between the idea of an angel and a saint, which sounds really stupid, but I was not educated, in any kind of formal religious education. So an angel is obviously I say obviously because it seems so obvious once I looked it up. These are creatures who are not, in fact, on earth. They're sort of the emissaries or the helpers of God. So they're sort of like a liaison between God and man, meaning man on earth. Whereas saints are people who have lived, lots and lots of different saints, obviously, and they're people who were then canonized. If you're talking about the Catholic Church, maybe in the Christian Church, maybe they only have saints in the Catholic Church, formally. I'm not really sure about that. But you have this idea of those as being terrestrial beings, but in fact are seen as holy. So then we have these 3 saints named: Florence's prayer, Gabriel's prayer, Elizabeth's prayer. What I love about that is that as soon as you get to Florence's prayer, which is on page 59, it's fairly early, you realize that you're going to hear from each of the 3 of them. So after the initial part, which is the 7th day, we are actually hearing about John's the 6th day of the week. It's the Saturday, and he's working very hard. There's a lot of stuff in the beginning about cleansing, about cleaning things. about dust. I think we can read that dust as being both sin, talking about filth and talking about sin, the idea of just never being able to really rid yourself of it. But we also think of like ashes to ashes, dust to dust. So in the beginning, we have this idea, it's John's birthday, he's working very hard. He does get the chance to go from Harlem, where the story takes place, down into Manhattan, and he goes and sees a movie. So he has a little bit of a break on his birthday. But then the real kind of most important part of the novel begins when he comes back and goes to the evening service at the church. So we have that beginning part, and in the end, we return to the story of John. But in the middle, we are going to hear from Florence, who is his aunt, and then Gabriel, who is John's dad, and then Elizabeth, who is John's mother, well, Gabriel being the stepdad. So we're going to hear from these three people, and I was so happy because Florence is such a compelling character in my mind. There are very, very strong women in this book, and Florence is just an absolute badass, and she's so articulate, and she's so upfront. I loved her so much that I was really happy to kind of dig in to her and her perspective and her story and really see things through her eyes. And this is kind of this virtuoso thing that Baldwin does that really should be maybe the main point of this lecture, which is that this is a writer who is 29 years old, who is able to inhabit these characters, the fictional aunt, the fictional stepfather, and the fictional mother, with so much depth and so much believability and so much importance. Each one of these characters is hugely important, and he inhabits them, even though he's only, in real life, James Baldwin was younger than 29. He was in his 20s and was able to take on the thoughts and the concerns and the awakening and the anger of people who are not his sex and people who are not his age, and people who've had radically different experiences. It is such an incredible thing, simply the structure of this, that he is able to take on the perspectives of these three people, and it's just incredible as a reader to be treated to them. Then, of course, we have part 3, which is the threshing floor, that begins on page 193. It's kind of interesting to note that Florence's section is about 25 pages. Gabriel's prayer is 60 and Elizabeth's is 40. And in my mind, that does kind of work. Florence is a slightly more minor character. Gabriel is a very large character. And Elizabeth is also a very large character. But we've had bits and pieces of her story already delivered to us. And also, this book, I think first and foremost, is the way that James Baldwin was struggling with the father figure, not so much with the maternal figure. Okay, we are now passing the title page and digging into part 1. So again, we have part 1 and we have the subtitle, The Seventh Day. And then we have a short passage from the book of Revelations. And the Spirit and the bride say, Come. And let him that heareth say, Come. And let him that is athirst come. And whosoever will, let him take of the water of life freely. So this seems to me a very optimistic part. It's also a part of Revelations. So right from the beginning, if you are someone who knows the Bible better than I do, I totally had to look that up, you would have this sense of this as being this revelation and expecting some sort of revelation. This comes from the King James Bible. And in many ways, I think this is optimistic. And we strike a very important optimistic note at the beginning, but also this notion of the water of life, but also the notion of thirst and the notion of taking something and getting something out of the church. Okay, and then we dive into the very first part. So here on the very first page, really at the beginning of the prose of the novel, we have a tiny extract from a hymn, and it reads, I looked down the line and I wondered. And there's a period there, so it's a complete thought. But in reality, I looked up the lyrics of the hymn, and it reads this, I looked down the line and I wondered how all things would come to be. And then it goes on and it's speaking to this idea of hiding someone's love and this idea of hiding the love behind the curve of the earth. And this is a part that mentions best intentions and worst impulses. So at the beginning here, we have something that is less clear, certainly to the reader, because it's only a tiny extract. If you knew this passage well, you would know that this has to do with a certain amount of uncertainty and this idea of having to hide. So we begin the first paragraph. Everyone had always said that John would be a preacher when he grew up, just like his father. It had been said so often that John, without ever thinking about it, had come to believe it himself. Not until the morning of his 14th birthday did he really begin to think about it, and by then it was already too late. So here we have the introduction of this day, which is his 14th birthday. And from this, we go a little bit into the backstory. So we go into his earliest memories. So that is the entire first paragraph. And of course, it's an extremely important paragraph and is introducing us to what is essentially the controlling idea of the novel, which is that everyone assumed that John would be a preacher like his father. And again, here we don't have anything about stepfather. We have the assumption that Gabriel is very much John's father. And we have this assumption that he would be a preacher, but right from the beginning, we also have this sense, it literally says that it was too late. So what he's saying is it's too late to consider it, but we know in fact that James Baldwin does not in fact go on to be a preacher, even if he did during his adolescence have a period where he was actively preaching in a church. But we know when he's writing this novel, when he's really digging into who he is as a person, that he knows that this character will not go on to be a preacher. So he drops then into his earliest memories. We have the introduction of his brother Roy, and it turns out that Gabriel Grimes was married to a woman named Deborah before he was married to Elizabeth. But when he was married to Deborah, he had an affair with a woman named Esther, and they had a son named Royal. And that son was in fact killed in a bar fight. And when he is with Elizabeth then, he has a son named Royal with Elizabeth. He has a son with Elizabeth and also names that son Royal. And during the birthday of John, we have an incident where the second Royal is stabbed just like the first Royal. So there's a lot of complexity in terms of the family. And I'm realizing as I'm starting here that at the beginning we don't know this. And there's this genius thing where later in the book we realize that Gabriel Grimes is not John's father. And the reason it's genius is because we are learning well into the novel, maybe a third of the way through, that in fact Gabriel is not John's father, just the way that John/James would have learned that his stepfather was not in fact his biological father. It's absolutely genius. But because we have read the book, and we're going back to the beginning, it's really interesting to look and see right from the beginning that this introduction of Roy speaks to the patterns that Gabriel Grimes cannot escape, because in fact he is someone who's incredibly hypocritical and espouses this deep religious devotion when in fact he is having affairs, he is drinking, he's having sex out of wedlock, he's doing all sorts of things that he should not be doing. So we have the introduction here of Roy, and we also have the introduction of the two sisters. And in the very beginning, the introduction is Sarah, who wore a red ribbon in her hair that day and was fondled by her father. So we have this sense right at the beginning of this man as being predatory. And there's a sense of honesty at the beginning that we're going to take a very honest look at this person who is a very dark presence in the lives of his children. So I was so struck in this novel with the way that family and religion and sex are mixed together right from the very start, and they stay mixed together the entire time. So I really do read this as a sexual awakening and as a religious awakening, and all of it is mixed together with family in such an interesting way. I want to look at pages 3 through 12. It's the very beginning of the novel, but right from the start, we in fact do have the presence of sex along with the presence of the family. So on page 4, this is literally the second page of the novel, we have this kind of statement about the Grimes family. Every Sunday morning then, since John could remember, they had taken to the streets, the Grimes family on their way to church. Sinners along the avenue watched them, men still wearing their Saturday night clothes, wrinkled and dusty now, muddy-eyed and muddy-faced, and women with harsh voices and tight, bright dresses, cigarettes between their fingers or held tightly in the corner of their mouths. I welcome you to think of the cigarette there as a phallic symbol that these women are holding or putting in their mouths. So right away we have the introduction of the Grimes family as religious, and then we have this juxtaposition and a much longer description of these sinners. So in fact, we also find out fairly early on that Gabriel is a real sinner. And this fixation on these sinners right from the beginning is introducing this idea of people who are saved and people who have sinned. I'm also going to say right at the beginning here, the church is right next to the hospital. In the beginning, we learn that. And in the end of the book, we have this ambulance coming. And the idea of death is very, very present at the end of the novel, and it is somewhat present here at the beginning with this idea of the hospital. And throughout the book, we have this refrain about how the wages of sin is death. And that repetition is going to keep at the front of mind the fact that death is very much tied to sin, and the fact that people in this structure of religion are either going to heaven or hell. There is a lot of Manichaean stuff in this book. So then very soon after we have the description of the family, who are this very devout family, and then the sinners, the much longer description of the sinners, we have this description. These men and women they passed on Sunday mornings had spent the night in bars or in cat houses or on the streets or on rooftops or under the stairs. They had been drinking. They had gone from cursing to laughter, to anger, to lust. Once, he and Roy had watched a man and a woman in the basement of a condemned house. They did it standing up. The woman had wanted 50 cents, and the man had flashed a razor. So right from the beginning, we have this idea of sex, and sex as something that is dangerous. And you have a sense already that this boy is turning 14. And when he says they did it standing up, you have the sense that he already has some knowledge of sex. And then on the very next page, on page 5, this kind of, this notion of really putting sex at the fore is even more obvious. And in fact, sex here is brought into the home. So it's not only something that's happening outside. I think it's also so amazing when he's describing all of the places these people might be. There are like 5 different places on rooftops, under the stairs. It's like people are having sex everywhere. And in fact, people are also having sex in his home. So right on page 5, his mother and his father, who went to church on Sundays, they did it too. And sometimes John heard them in the bedroom behind him, over the sound of rats' feet and rats' screams, and the music and cursing from the harlot's house downstairs. So you have this idea here of sex as being everywhere. Both women who are sex workers, you have the harlot, you have the house of the harlots, you also have their home, and in fact, sex occurring in their home. Right after this description of the mother and the father and the fact that they also do it, and that he hears them over the top of these rats screaming, is the introduction of their church. It's incredible. So we have the house of the harlot, and then the very next sentence, their church was called the Temple of the Fire Baptized. It was not the biggest church in Harlem. So then we have some description of Harlem and putting the church into perspective. But the important thing here is that in these first 2 pages of the novel, we are having this melding together of the family, of religion, and of sex. And I would argue that there is this braiding of those elements all throughout the entire book, and that James Baldwin's attempt, in fact, to understand his father and understand religion is also tied up in this idea of trying to understand his burgeoning sexuality. So here at the beginning of the book, at the first part called The 7th Day, which is in fact John's birthday, and we're learning about his past memories and his home, we also have the introduction of the idea of him desiring young men. So on page 6, just like so early in the book, we have the introduction of Elijah. And Elijah is a very important figure because he is someone who is in the church. He is already a preacher, but he is a young person. He plays basketball. He's flirting with young women. He is someone that for John is an incredibly attractive and magnetic and important figure, but he is an example of sexuality and religion literally all mushed together in the same person. So on page 6, we have this description. He was not much older than John, only 17, and he was already saved and was a preacher. John stared at Elijah all during the lesson, admiring the timbre of Elijah's voice, much deeper and manlier than his own, admiring the leanness and grace and strength and darkness of Elijah in his Sunday suit, wondering if he would ever be holy as Elijah was holy. But he did not follow the lesson, and when, sometimes, Elijah paused to ask John a question, John was ashamed and confused, feeling the palms of his hands become wet and his heart pound like a hammer. Elijah would smile and reprimand him gently, and the lesson would go on. So there's so much here. We have this idea, the physical description is very much admiring, and there are lots of sexual overtones, even the idea of the wetness of his palms. You have an idea of sort of masturbation, and in fact, masturbation is the sin that John has committed on the morning of his birthday. So we're going to move on a little bit with the idea of Elijah, who is a young preacher, as being this kind of object of affection. And here we have this idea of Elijah as being sort of even further out of the realm of possibility and all the more attractive to the young John. On page 9, we have this. There was sin among them. One Sunday, when regular service was over, Father James had uncovered sin in the congregation of the righteous. He had uncovered Elijah and Ella May. They had been walking disorderly. They were in danger of straying from the truth. And as Father James spoke of the sin that he knew they had not committed yet, of the unripe fig plucked too early from the tree to set the children's teeth on edge, John felt himself grow dizzy in his seat and could not look at Elijah where he stood beside LMA before the altar. So again, we have this idea of him really focusing. He does not particularly care about LMA. He's very focused on Elijah. But it's very important also that these two have not sinned yet. Elijah is someone who is still essentially available to John. We don't know, in fact, what Elijah's sexual preferences are, but he is someone that our young John can absolutely fantasize about. And at the end, Elijah does play a very, very important role, both in terms of allowing young John to kind of enter into the fold, meaning the religious community, and find God. It is very much Elijah's voice that is bringing him to God. But it is also, you get the sense of Elijah as helping John along in terms of accepting him as a person and essentially promising him some sort of salvation, while also giving sort of a vague acknowledgement of the fact that John has these feelings for him that are complex and deep. We're going to take a quick look here at the way in which John sins in the beginning, because this sin is very important. Again, this is very much about religion and sexuality as being entwined together. But it's important to recognize that the morning of his birthday, he has committed what he thinks is a sin. And so in some ways, he sees himself as already fallen, and that his religious redemption is all the more important. So on page 10, I mean, it's unbelievable. It starts on page 3. We're like 7 pages into the novel, and we have this. John's birthday fell on a Saturday in March in 1935. He awoke on this birthday morning with a feeling that there was menace in the air around him, that something irrevocable had occurred in him. He stared at a yellow stain on the ceiling just above his head. Roy was still smothered in the bedclothes, and his breath came and went with a small whistling sound. There was no other sound anywhere. No one in the house was up. The neighbors' radios were all silent, and his mother hadn't yet risen to fix his father's breakfast. John wondered at his panic, then wondered about the time, and then, while the yellow stain on the ceiling slowly transformed itself into a woman's nakedness, he remembered that it was his 14th birthday and that he had sinned. And then a little further down, he had sinned, in spite of the saints, his mother and father, the warnings he had heard from his earliest beginnings. He had sinned with his hands, a sin that was hard to forgive. In the school lavatory, alone, thinking of the boys, older, bigger, braver, who made bets with each other as to whose urine could arch higher, he had watched in himself a transformation of which he would never dare to speak. So you have, with this idea of this yellow stain and with this idea of being in bed with his brother, who is male, I'm not talking about incest, I'm just talking about a male body being close to his, then this idea of this stain as being transformed into the body of a woman, we are talking there about sexual desire as well. I think in many ways you can read this novel as a queer novel, but it also has to do with sexual awakening in general, not just the idea of struggling with homosexual desire. But then when we have this description of him in the bathroom and being very interested in the other boys' arcing urine, you have this sense of ejaculation, you have this sense of penises, and you have this sense of him having sinned with his hands, so you have a strong sense here of masturbation. Importantly, right after that description of him as having sinned, we have this introduction of the idea of him as being different. And in fact, he says he's not going to live like his father or their fathers, because in fact, he has been recognized by his teachers in school as being very bright and having a certain intellect that needs to be developed. I mentioned in the other lecture that in James Baldwin's senior page in his yearbook, he said something like, "Fame is the spur, ouch." So you have this sense of him as being a very ambitious young man, certainly by the end of high school. And in some ways, it's really beautiful to think of the fact that he is writing about a struggle, John Grimes's struggle, which is also in many ways, at least if we're going to map James Baldwin's life onto the novel, would have been one that James Baldwin also shared, what with his monstrous stepfather and his desire for young men and his crisis of faith and his role as a preacher. This is someone who has found his voice, and we have the introduction of that idea at the very beginning of the book, pages 10 to 14, this idea of him as being exceptionally bright and someone whose mind is his most important asset, and he comes back to that throughout the book. Okay, this is a very good segue into the idea of the narrative stance of the book. We'll just cover this very briefly. So this is a book that is told in the third person, simply meaning that we say John did this and Florence did that and Gabriel says this. And that's extremely important because if it were a first-person narrator, if it were I did this and I did that, and it were only John, it would be very, very limited, obviously. And it's fascinating to go into the lives of these other people. But it's also important that it is not a bunch of first-person narrations. He absolutely could have made that choice. We could have John's section told from the first person, I did this, I awoke, I had masturbated, blah, blah, blah. Then you could have Florence's section, I did this and I hated my brother and he was a dick. Like you could go through all of them in the first person. I think it's extremely important that they're in the third person because, in fact, this is a book about discovery. And this is a book about people whose idea of themselves and whose knowledge about themselves is somewhat limited. In John's case, it's because he is young and he has impulses about who he loves and his intellect and how he wants to live his life that are totally at odds with everyone's expectation for him. And even with Gabriel, with Florence, with Elizabeth, these are people who don't have the gift of a lot of self-reflection. So it makes perfect sense that they don't fully understand themselves or their impulses or why they are sinning, quote unquote sinning, or why they're doing these different things. So the fact that it is in the third person is excellent because we enter into their thoughts, but not so fully that they would be sort of telling us all of their thoughts and what they are thinking. It's really very strong. So we already began the beginning. Everyone had always said that John would be a preacher when he grew up, just like his father. I mean, that is it's really like a masterful sentence. It's really laying out the main crux of the story. But then on page 59, we have section 1 of part 2 being called the prayers of the saints. We have Florence's prayer. So we have that same third person saying this. Florence raised her voice in the only song she could remember that her mother used to sing. It's me, it's me, it's me, O Lord, standing in the need of prayer. So that's an example of Florence as, we're having her in the third person. So we have this structure that is so incredibly well done because we are entering into the thoughts of each one of these people. And in each of their sections, we learn a lot about their backstory, which is very important. And it is so astonishing to realize how much of this James Baldwin, some of it would have been family stories, certainly, but those could have only been jumping off points because he, in fact, had to build all of these scenes with all of their verisimilitude and their excellent dialogue. They're really so full and rich and rounded and convincing. But the other thing that he's doing structurally is not just the idea of part 1, then the 3 prayers of the saints, and then the part 3 where we return to John's story, but there's also this incredible temporal structure. So I just mean in terms of time. So in the beginning we have John, and we have this idea that it is in fact his birthday. And from the very start, we are toggling between this very first day and then the times in the past. And we have that same structure throughout. So in each case, when we first see Florence, when we first kind of enter into her story, it is Florence in the church entering into the service on Saturday night. So we follow John throughout the day, and then Florence enters, and then we go backward in time and we learn about Florence when she is younger. We learn about why she leaves the South. We learn about her relationship with her brother, who she does not get along with, and with her mother, and we learn about her conflicts and her desires. So we're learning about these things, but then we're also moving forward into the moment that is the front story, which is all of them together in the church in Harlem. Then when we go to Gabriel, same thing. We have Gabriel in the church in these very important, very pressured moments, but then we also have this incredible digression into the past, which every time we move into the past and we learn all of these different things, and then we come back to this front story, the idea of them all being in the church together, it's just unbelievable. It's such a rich way to do it, especially because this idea of the front story, we have John's day, but then he goes to this service and we understand that all of them gathering together for this evening service on a Saturday is very tense and it's very moving and it's very impactful. So this idea of learning more about all of these people and then returning to the front story is just absolute genius. Just as I figured, there is so much to say about this novel that I'm finding myself saying much, much more than I have in my notes. As a result, we are not going to have time to talk about figurative language, but I will say there are two different sequences in the book where I had this idea that I was going to really essentially do the entire lecture just based on this one short passage because it is in fact such incredible prose. The one I'm thinking of is actually one of Gabriel's dreams, and this is a little misguided. I think maybe I was very caffeinated when I read it or something. It's an incredible, incredible piece of prose, but I do not, in fact, think it's a great lens through which to look at the entire work. But what I wanted to say about figurative language that is so important is this idea that a lot of it is metaphor. So a lot of it is saying it's like fire, or it is like a storm, or this was like a night, a dark night. So you have this idea of comparing things to each other. And what I think is so remarkable about James Baldwin's use of figurative language is he's trying out all of these different ways to articulate things. So throughout the book, there's both an incredible clarity. Right from the beginning, we know what young John is obsessed with, and we have lots of information about who he is and his character. I mean, you can also argue that it's incredibly complex and we really don't know him and he doesn't know himself. But I would argue, in fact, that a lot of him is already there, and a lot of Florence is there, and a lot of Elizabeth is there. We know a lot about these very, very strong characters. We certainly know a lot about Gabriel. It's a very slim novel, and yet we really do know these people. But because it is a book that is trying to imagine what someone's biological father was like, what their stepfather might actually be all about, because the entire book is meant to discover things, I love the use of figurative language because it is essentially trying out all sorts of different things. Is Gabriel's relationship with religion like a storm? So you have this sense of using these comparisons, not just, to have fancy, beautiful prose, but to help the reader understand how difficult it is to articulate these things and all the different ways that you would need to try to express them well and to understand them. So just simply the ways to think about things and the way to frame them and the way in order to have them make sense, but also to create a narrative that is going to be one that is going to sustain both John Grimes and James Baldwin. So I would imagine we are going to see some of that incredible figurative language in the last part of the lecture, which is that I want to look at the last part of the book called the threshing floor as a sort of culmination of the novel. So this is a mere 30 pages. We heard quite a bit about John's birthday in the beginning. We have Florence, then Gabriel, then Elizabeth. And now we come to this culmination, which is the experience first and foremost of John, but also of everyone in the church. And it goes on throughout the entire night. There's a concept in religion of moving through the dark night of the soul. It's this sense of passive purification, so that you go through this experience and essentially God is kind of working his ways on you, and you will awaken with a soul that is lighter, and one that in this case has accepted Jesus Christ, because you have gone in fact through this time of doubt and this time of feeling lost. So I'm going to back up a little bit though. So part 3 is called the threshing floor. So I knew about this in the agricultural sense. If you thresh something, a threshing floor is just a hard surface, and you would, if you're a farmer, you would beat the grain and you would separate the wheat from the chaff. So this is such a good metaphor. I mean, talk about figurative language. This idea of the threshing floor as being the place where you're going to separate out what is important and what is just chaff, what is not important, that really is very much about what is happening in the church on this night. So not only do we have the threshing floor as this metaphor, but we also have this thing from the book of Isaiah. Then said I, woe is me, for I am undone, because I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. For mine eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. So this idea of unclean lips has everything to do with dust. In the beginning of this section, when John in fact falls to the threshing floor in this kind of moment when he is kind of taken by the Spirit, he follows after Elijah, and it's very fitting that he is following after Elijah. But we have this idea of his lips as being dust, full of dust. Again, this is echoing all of the dust that we are seeing in the beginning, but it's this inability to speak. So you have this sense of John and James Baldwin as really finding a voice through this kind of dark night of the soul, which will end, in fact, with this religious awakening. So we move on and we have yet another hymn, a little chunk of a little hymn here that says, Then I buckled up my shoes and I started. So that is all we have. Again, it has a period. It's as if it's a fragment, but it's sort of finished by the period. But in fact, the hymn says this: "Then I buckled up my shoes and I started walking just to see how far I was from God." Which is so significant. I mean, part of me, I'm happy that I looked these up and I'm happy that I have a better sense of them. But if you were someone who recognized these hymns as, as what they are, as larger stories, it's so important. This idea of buckling my shoes, this idea of starting and buckling shoes, you get the sense that he's preparing and he's going on a long journey. But what I did not know is this nuance about wanting to know how far he was from God. So at the very beginning of this threshing floor section, which is the culmination of the novel, we have this idea of him beginning and trying to figure out how far he is from God. And when I say he, I'm talking about both John and in many ways, James Baldwin himself. And the section begins like this. "He knew, without knowing how it happened, that he lay on the floor in the dusty space before the altar, which he and Elijah had cleaned, and knew that above him burned the yellow light which he himself had switched on. Dust was in his nostrils, sharp and terrible, and the feet of the saints, shaking the floor beneath him, raised small clouds of dust that filmed his mouth. He heard their cries, so far, so high above him, he could never rise that far. He was like a rock, a dead man's body, a dying bird, fallen from an awful height, something that had no power of itself anymore to turn." So this is talk about beautiful metaphorical language here. We have this, it's actually a simile. He was like a rock, a dead man's body, a dying bird fallen from an awful height, something that had no power of itself anymore to turn. So you have this sense here, through this incredible language of the difficulty of explaining what is happening to him. You have all of these comparisons to help us as readers and to help John himself understand what is happening to him. So you have also the idea of the voices of the saints. The saints, of course, are the people we have just heard from, with a couple of other people who actually function very much like a Greek chorus. We have this group of the praying Mother Washington, and there are a couple of people who are Sister so-and-so and Sister so-and-so. I can't remember their names right now. But you have this group of women, so you have this idea of the strength of all of these women. Elijah is there and Florence is there. Really notably, in fact, LMA is not there, which we're going to get to that in a minute. But you have all of these women who are, in fact, these saints. They are holy people on earth, and and what he is hearing from them is the shuffling of their feet. So this idea of, he's just buckled his shoes. So this idea of shuffling, this idea of moving your feet and getting closer to God, but also the idea of their voices. So in the beginning, we have John on the floor. And then on the next page, we hear a different voice. This is a malicious, ironic voice. We have this on page 196. "He wanted to rise. A malicious, ironic voice insisted that he rise, and at once to leave this temple and go out into the world. He wanted to obey the voice, which was the only voice that spoke to him. He tried to assure the voice that he would do his best to rise. He would only lie there a moment after his dreadful fall and catch his breath." So this idea of him having fallen, I think we can read that in many ways as having sinned, as having felt for the first time that he has really sinned in this new way, which I would argue is his sexuality, and that he has fallen low. And part of what happens in this kind of saving, this kind of baptism that happens during the course of the long night of his soul, is in fact that he is accepting the idea of having sinned and the fact that he will be forgiven. We then move from this voice, which we're going to explain, to Elijah, right across the way. "Yes, there was Elijah speaking from the floor, and his father silent at his back." So his father, throughout this thing, is silent. He is someone who we are not hearing a lot from. What we are hearing, in fact, is this malicious, ironic voice. And then on the next page, we have this incredible revelation. His father does, in fact, say different things, but his father's voice is not the most important. In fact, we have a comparison here of the father's voice with this malicious, ironic voice. And this is when we learn, in fact, what that voice is. This is another incredible example of the reader as realizing something the same way that John would. In the beginning, on 2 pages before, on 196, John does not know who the malicious, ironic voice is, and the reader doesn't either. And then it is so satisfying 2 pages later when you find out, in fact, the same time that John is finding out who this ironic, malicious voice belongs to. So we have Gabriel say this. Set thine house in order, said his father, for thou shalt die and not live. That is a refrain that his father is saying over and over, and it is, of course, ironic because Gabriel's house is not in order. He's abusive of his children. He had an affair on his first wife. He's keeping secrets from people. He is fondling his daughter. He is someone whose house is totally out of order. And so it's this incredible hypocrisy that his refrain over and over is, set thine house in order. So we have him saying, set thine house in order. And then the ironic voice spoke again, saying, get up, John. Get up, boy. Don't let him keep you here. You got everything your daddy got. I couldn't believe it. I was so moved. So this is his biological father. My sense here is that this other voice that he is hearing, and in fact, this is someone who is dead. We know from Elizabeth's part that he was framed for a crime he did not commit and that he killed himself in jail. So you have this voice coming to John that is really the powerful voice. It is the voice that gets him up off the floor. It is the voice that accepts him and essentially says, you have everything I have given you. So we have this stepfather with this father voice saying, set thine house in order in this super hypocritical way. And then we have the voice of daddy, this daddy here, who is really bringing him up. So then right across the way, we have this idea of this mountaintop. So the idea of rising, it's not just rising off the floor, it's this mountaintop. And this is an introduction, I think, of his ambition. I mean, you have, again, the title of the book is Go Tell It on the Mountain. You have this idea of him rising not just up, but using his voice, becoming a preacher, and telling it from the mountain. John is the one who is going to ascend, even though he knows, we have this refrain over and over, that he will have to ascend the steep side of the mountain. So then, right after we have the introduction of the mountain, we have a reiteration of his sin, the idea of the bathroom. And here we touch again on nakedness. The idea of nakedness comes up over and over throughout the book. And when you have nakedness, one thing to think about is that Adam and Eve were naked in the Garden of Eden, and when they in fact ate from the tree of knowledge, part of the knowledge that they were gaining was in fact that they had sinned, but also that they were naked. So nakedness is very much associated with sin, and this idea of original sin, this idea of eating from the tree of knowledge, has everything to do with nakedness and the shame at being naked. Nakedness is something that comes up over and over throughout the novel. So then we move into this dark night of the soul. And we have, again, this idea of the ironic voice. So in the dark night of his soul, both the ironic voice really comes down kind of hard on him. And then his father, his stepfather, the preacher, the deacon, Grimes, also comes down hard on him. So everybody is really making him difficult. It's a very hard trial for him. But we are moving through this dark night of the soul. And part of it has to do with sex. So again, we have this presence of sex. So on page 201, his father reached for him, but John was faster. He moved backward down the shining street, looking at his father who moved toward him, one hand outstretched in fury. And his father, in fury, says this, and I heard you all the nighttime long. I know what you do in the dark, black man, when you think the devil's son's asleep. I heard you spitting and groaning and choking. And I seen you riding up and down and going in and out. I ain't the devil's son for nothing. So you have this idea here of his stepfather as literally becoming, this kind of Satan figure, but also as naming his sin. And in fact, that sin is this idea of masturbation. So in this dark night of the soul, we have the introduction, or the echo, in fact, of this idea of his sin. Then we move on to the next page, and we have more of this idea of the dust in his mouth. And during the dark night of the soul, we have this absolutely crucial passage. So what James Baldwin does is he talks when John is in agony and isn't sure if he's going to live and survive. He begins this description of what must be read as the middle passage of African people being brought to the United States to be enslaved. And the way that I read this in part was that he's essentially sort of explaining why his stepfather has so much anger and rage, and that this terrible thing has been done to Black people, and that in fact all of the fury and all of the self-doubt and all of the sort of bad stuff in his stepfather, there is kind of an explanation for it. This is absolutely crucial. It's on page 203 in my copy, and it says this. And now in his moaning, and so far from any help, he heard it in himself. It rose from his bleeding, his cracked open heart. It was a sound of rage and weeping which filled the grave, rage and weeping from time set free, but bound now in eternity. Rage that had no language, weeping with no voice, which yet spoke now to John's startled soul of boundless melancholy, of the bitterest patience and the longest night, of the deepest water, the strongest chains, the most cruel lash, of humility most wretched, the dungeon most absolute, of love's bed defiled and birth dishonored, and most bloody, unspeakable, sudden death. Yes, the darkness hummed with murder, the body in the water, the body in the fire, the body on the tree. John looked down the line of these armies of darkness, army upon army, and his soul whispered, "Who are these? Who are they?" and wondered, "Where shall I go?" There was no answer. So this is, it's just was, it is absolutely crucial to any understanding of the book. And in many ways, the extension of this is all of the work that James Baldwin will do in the civil rights movement. But in the heart of this night, of this searching of the soul and sort of the depths of the darkness of the soul, you have essentially what is this kind of this description of the horror of what it would be like to be enslaved. And in fact, because we know that James Baldwin's own father, David Baldwin, and in this case, Gabriel Grimes, they were both people who had been born into enslavement. So I think what we are reading here is an explanation for why, in fact, those people do have such a hard time. So then we move on, and we move on toward lightness, and I loved this. So one of the things that happens is we have the beginning, we have the inclusion here and sort of the braiding in of the hymn about John the Baptist. And it's a very jubilant song. It is another hymn that I am, in fact, pretty well aware of, and it's jubilant, and it's about, and in addition to that, we have, in fact, John, our character, seeing the Lord. So we have on 207, "Then John saw the Lord for a moment only, and the darkness for a moment only was filled with a light he could not bear. Then in a moment he was set free. His tears sprang as from a fountain, his heart like a fountain of waters burst. Then he cried, 'O blessed Jesus, O Lord Jesus, take me through.'" So again, here we have this beautiful figurative language, his heart like a fountain of waters burst, which is a really beautiful echo of the idea at the beginning of this section about thirst. Those who have thirst will drink from the water of life. So you have this beautiful idea here of his heart as being full. And then we have this incredible slippage where he glimpses God, and then who he sees is Elijah. So we have a brief paragraph and then this. "Oh yes," cried the voice of Elijah, "bless our God forever." And a sweetness filled John as he heard this voice and heard the sound of singing. The singing was for him, for his drifting soul was anchored in the love of God, in the rock that endured forever. The light and the darkness had kissed each other and were married now forever in the life and the vision of John's soul. So then we begin with the beautiful hymn. And a little further down, "It was Elijah who had spoken. He stood just above John smiling, and behind him were the saints, praying Mother Washington and Sister McCandless and Sister Price. Behind these he saw Mother and his aunt, his father. His father, for the moment, was hidden from his view." So this is that sort of female energy that I was talking about earlier, this very sort of, this idea of this maternal force, or this kind of ant-like force that is really helping to deliver him. But of course it is Elijah who is most important. So we have some more about the hymn of John the Baptist. Then we have this hilarious thing where, he and Elijah are really communing. And on page 211, we have this. There were two instances of humor in the book that really got me. It is not, in fact, a funny book, but I found this very funny. On page 211, "They were all there, save young Ella May, who had departed while John was still on the floor. She had a bad cold," said praying Mother Washington, "and needed to have her rest." Which is so funny to me, because this is, it could be considered a little ham-handed on the part of James Baldwin of just like needing to get Ella May out of the picture so that he could have this real communion between John and Elijah. But it totally works because, in fact, the moment is so important, and you've come to this incredible culmination that you're like, obviously we need Ella May out of the picture. Then a little bit further down, Now, in 3 groups, they walked the long, gray, silent avenue, praying Mother Washington and Elizabeth and Sister McCandless and Sister Price, and before them Gabriel and Florence, and Elijah and John ahead. So again, you have this idea of Elijah and John as being very much a pair, as being very much together. And in fact, James Baldwin was a preacher from the time he was 14, so you get the sense that maybe John, is finding his voice and is following in the footsteps of Elijah, but you also get the sense of a union between the two of them, which is so satisfying because of the fact that in the early part of the book, John is so attracted to him and feels so much affection and love for him. Then we have this incredible part. I mean, I just can't believe what is packed into these 30 pages. We essentially have some snippets of dialogue in italics, and it is Richard and Elizabeth remembering when they first met. So Richard is John's biological father, and they met in the South at a store where Richard was working, and they had this kind of love at first sight thing. And we have a little snippet of it here on page 213. It is so beautifully done. We're not going to go into it, but I want to make the point here that we have this idea of his birthday. So this is in fact his birthday. It's also the day that he is being sort of saved. Well, it's the day, his birthday is the day before, but the second birthday is the day that he has essentially been saved, both by Elijah and by God and by all of the saints, all of these people, especially women around him. But then we also have this emphasis on the fact that his birthday harkens back to the time when his parents met. So we have this idea of his actual birth, like his biological father, as having a real presence here, not just, I would argue, with that ironic voice, but here with Elizabeth in a way that is so beautiful. And then James Baldwin goes on, and we have this excellent passage where Florence really just makes Gabriel take some responsibility, and she really takes him to task. And part of me was like, wait, we're on page 216 here. This book is going to be over in 5 pages, and here we still have Florence, who's such a badass. We have Florence just really taking Gabriel down a peg and not letting him continue with this sense of inflated ego and all of the ways that he is dodging any responsibility. I couldn't believe it. It feels a little bit squashed in there, but it was so satisfying because in many ways the ending is it's very much an echo of the first part. It's very much a bookend, and so it's really satisfying. In the beginning, we see the photograph of Florence on the mantle, and she's this kind of formidable presence in the beginning of the book. And in the end, we love the fact that she, as a strong woman, is the one who is taking her brother to task. And the last 4 pages of the book are just an incredible masterclass in just how to finish a novel that it's so slim, but it is so full and so incredibly impactful. So on page 220, we essentially have John as returning to the street, returning to his kind of earthly world. And it's so beautiful because he's very realistic about what is going to happen when he enters back into the world. The Lord's day broke outside. When John should walk these streets again, they would be shouting here again. The roar of children's roller skates would bear down on him from behind. Little girls in pigtails, skipping rope, would establish on the sidewalk a barricade through which he must stumble as best he might. Boys would be throwing ball in the streets again. They would look at him and call, "Hey, frog eyes." Men would be standing on corners again, watching him pass. Girls would be sitting on stoops again, mocking his walk. Grandmothers would stare out of their windows, saying, "That sure is a sorry little boy." So a couple of very important things here. This notion of frog eyes, we hear it in the beginning and we hear it in the end. We obviously are witnessing him being bullied, but the frog eyes is important because I think this is an invitation on the part of James Baldwin to read this as autobiographical. James Baldwin himself has very distinctive eyes. I think he's such a beautiful person, and happily we have many photographs of him. I'll throw a few up on the YouTube if you're watching. So we have this very kind of realistic vision of what life is going to be like. It's not that he's saved and everything's going to be fabulous. In fact, things are going to be difficult. So we have that, and happily, we do not end on that note. We move forward with Elijah. So we have Elijah and John together, and I love the ending of the book. I'm going to go ahead and read it here. What I love is the fact that it is Elijah and Elizabeth, which it's very interesting. Just now it occurred to me that those names are similar. So you have these 2 people at the end who are essentially anointing him with these kisses. And I love that it is the 2 of them who are promising, in fact, that God will not forsake John and that John will will continue to be saved and will not have to face the darkness again. So at the bottom of 225, Elijah grinned and looked up at his father. "He come through," cried Elijah, "didn't he, Deacon Grimes? The Lord done laid him out and turned him around and wrote his new name down in glory. Bless our God." And he kissed John on the forehead, a holy kiss. "Run on, little brother," Elijah said. "Don't you get weary. God won't forget you. You won't forget." Then he turned away down the long avenue home. John stood still, watching him walk away. The sun had come fully awake. It was waking the streets and the houses and crying at the windows. It fell over Elijah like a golden robe and struck John's forehead where Elijah had kissed him, like a seal ineffaceable forever. And he felt his father behind him, and he felt the March wind rise, striking through his damp clothes against his salty body. He turned to face his father. He found himself smiling, but his father did not smile. They looked at each other a moment. His mother stood in the doorway in the long shadows of the hall. "I'm ready," John said. "I'm coming. I'm on my way." It's so beautiful. I love this idea of the sun rising. I love all of the optimism and the hope, but there's also this kind of tinging of reality. He's facing his father, and what he feels is this cold wind, and we have this reference again to the night that has left him sweaty and cold and chilled. So you have it's not this idea that everything's going to be great, but there is so much hope because of Elijah, and then because we are ending with the presence of the mother and this idea of walking into the home, but also this idea of John saying, "I'm ready, I'm coming, I'm on my way." It's so beautiful. We began, as you remember, with the idea of buckling his shoes and finding out how far he was from God, and then this idea of being ready at the end. I also, again, love the fact that this feels like a preamble. It feels sort of like the beginning of what is happening for James Baldwin. This is a young boy who's 14 years old and who's been through this incredible trial in 24 hours and has come from all of these people who have conflict and who have real difficulties and have faced incredible challenges. And we end on this incredible note of optimism. It's so beautiful. This is a book that deserves a rereading, obviously, and I'm really excited to dig in more to the body of work that is James Baldwin's fiction and his nonfiction. But thank you so much for listening. I hope that this was instructive and that you learned something and that you had like maybe a fraction of the fun that I did in really digging into what is an incredible, incredible piece of work. Happy reading.